We have built a beautiful, pristine myth around the giants of ancient history. When we look at their cold, white marble statues standing quietly in modern museums, we instinctively imagine them as perfect, bloodless saints. We picture them as men who possessed absolute mental clarity, men who walked through sunlit Greek academies or sat in imperial Roman chambers, completely untouched by the raw, chaotic, and often grotesque realities of ordinary human life. We treat their words like holy scriptures born from pure light. But history by its very nature has a shadow. A dark, uncomfortable, and bleeding shadow that modern textbooks deliberately choose to ignore. The brilliant minds that laid the concrete foundations of Western civilization, human ethics, and logic were not operating in a vacuum of pure righteousness. They were real, flawed human beings trapped in brutal eras. Many of them fought severe personal madness, committed unforgivable political betrayals, and harbored secrets that would deeply shock our modern moral sensibilities. Wisdom, it seems, is almost never born in comfort. It is frequently birthed in the deepest, most terrifying darkness of the human condition. Today we strip away the romanticized lore and the polished myths. We step past the clean museum displays to look directly into the moral abyss of history. Here are 7 dark secrets of the ancient philosophers that you were never supposed to know. Welcome back to Sapientia In Turbinen. Brace your mind. Let us descend. Secret number 1. The cult of mathematics committed cold-blooded murder to protect a mathematical secret. Pythagoras of Samos is universally remembered today as a gentle mathematical genius, the man behind the famous theorem every child learns in school. But behind this academic reputation lies a terrifying truth. Pythagoras was actually the supreme leader of a radical, fanatical religious cult. His followers, known as the Pythagoreans, did not just study math, they literally worshipped numbers. They believed with absolute, unyielding religious fervor that the entire universe was constructed strictly out of perfect, whole numbers and clean ratios. To them, math was God, and any flaw in math was a sin against the divine order. They lived by extreme, secretive rules, swore absolute oaths of silence, and anyone who leaked their secret doctrines faced swift execution. The crisis came when a brilliant young disciple named Hippasus of Metapontum made a catastrophic discovery. While working on the geometry of a square, Hippasus mathematically proved the existence of irrational numbers, specifically the square root of 2. This was a number that could never be expressed as a perfect fraction, a number that cascaded into infinite chaos. For the Pythagorean cult, this was not just a new mathematical theory, it was a cosmic nightmare. It proved that their entire religion was built on a lie, that the universe was fundamentally irrational. Instead of adjusting their beliefs to accept the scientific truth, the cult chose violence. According to ancient accounts, they took Hippasus out to sea on a small boat under the guise of a regular journey. Once they were far enough from the shore, out in the deep, dark water, they grabbed the young genius and threw him overboard, deliberately drowning him alive to bury his discovery. The father of geometry successfully protected his religious dogma by staining the ocean with the blood of his most brilliant student. Secret number 2. The great philosopher of ethics justified human slavery and fueled one of the bloodiest imperial conquests in human history. Aristotle is revered as the intellectual foundation of Western philosophy. He wrote beautifully and extensively about virtue, human happiness, and the concept of justice. Yet, history conveniently forgets that Aristotle was the personal tutor, mentor, and intellectual architect behind Alexander the Great, the Macedonian conqueror who brought devastating war, slaughter, and destruction to millions of innocent people across Asia. Aristotle did not use his immense wisdom to soften the violent, megalomaniacal ambitions of the young prince. Instead, he systematically fueled them with dangerous philosophical justifications. Aristotle created the horrific theory of natural slavery. He argued in his writings that certain human beings, specifically non-Greeks, lacked the internal capacity for rational thought and were therefore born naturally to be mastered by force, just like domestic animals. He explicitly advised Alexander to treat his Greek subjects as friends and leaders, but to treat foreigners and barbarians as plants or animals. This toxic philosophy gave Alexander the perfect moral justification to conquer, enslave, and butcher entire civilizations without a single ounce of guilt. The absolute peak of Greek intellect was weaponized to validate the iron chains of millions. The ancient school of absolute inner calm was fundamentally, darkly intertwined with voluntary self-destruction. Stoicism is incredibly popular today. It teaches us how to remain calm inside the violent storms of life, how to endure pain, and how to master our emotions. But modern self-help gurus rarely mention that the ancient Stoic school harbored a deeply unsettling, casual obsession with suicide. The Stoics did not view self-destruction as a tragic sin or a mental health failure. Instead, they viewed it as a perfectly logical, noble exit strategy. They routinely referred to suicide by a poetic, chilling metaphor, the open door. They believed that if life became inconvenient or unmanageable, you should simply walk out of the door. This bizarre obsession is perfectly illustrated by the death of Zeno of Citium, one of the legendary founder of Stoicism himself. Zeno had spent his entire life preaching emotional control and alignment with nature. One afternoon when he was 90 years old, Zeno tripped while walking out of his school and accidentally broke his toe. For an ordinary human, this is a minor painful accident. But for the fanatical mind of Zeno, it was an intolerable sign from the universe that his physical form was decaying and losing its autonomy. Instead of seeking medical help, Zeno struck the ground with his hand, quoted a dark line from an old Greek play saying, "I am coming of my own accord, why do you call me?" and promptly choked himself to death on the spot. For the very creators of eternal inner peace, human life was completely disposable the exact moment absolute control was compromised. The most famous philosopher of poverty was secretly a corrupt, predatory billionaire. Lucius Annaeus Seneca wrote some of the most beautiful, comforting letters in human history. He constantly advised his friends to embrace a minimalist life, to despise luxury, to fast, and to remain completely detached from material wealth. He wrote that true freedom is living as if you own nothing. But history reveals a grotesque double standard. While Seneca was typing these profound words of minimalist wisdom, he was actively accumulating one of the most obscene, corrupt fortunes in the ancient world. Seneca was the political advisor and handler to the psychopathic Roman Emperor Nero. Through his corrupt political proximity to the tyrant, Seneca extracted immense land, power, and money, becoming a literal billionaire in modern terms. He owned sprawling estates, hundreds of slaves, and lived in staggering luxury. Even worse, Seneca accumulated much of his wealth through predatory lending. He forced massive high-interest loans onto conquered nations such as Celtic Britain. When the impoverished citizens of Britain could not pay back his extreme interest rates, Seneca aggressively called in his debts all at once, destabilizing the entire region. This ruthless financial greed directly triggered a violent, bloody British rebellion where thousands of people were slaughtered. Seneca preached the quiet tranquility of the soul, but his luxurious lifestyle was directly funded by the blood and misery of the Roman Empire. The champion of absolute human freedom crossed the line into public degeneracy and animalistic filth. Diogenes of Sinope is widely celebrated as one of the most rebellious and entertaining figures in history. He famously mocked arrogant kings, rejected societal greed, and lived inside a discarded clay barrel to prove that humans don't need society to be happy. He called himself a citizen of the world and fought for total authenticity. But modern retellings usually sanitize his methods, because the reality of how Diogenes lived was deliberately repulsive and shocking. Diogenes believed that because human rules and manners were artificial constructs, anything that is natural should be performed openly in public without filters. He took this philosophy to its absolute, gross extreme. He routinely defecated and urinated in the middle of the crowded Athenian marketplace while shouting insults at passers-by. If a wealthy noble invited him over for dinner, Diogenes would bark like an animal and spit directly into the host's face. Most notoriously, he openly and frequently masturbated in the public square, right in front of horrified citizens and children. When the shocked public confronted him for his shameless degeneracy, he simply laughed and crudely replied, "If only it were as easy to banish hunger by rubbing an empty stomach." He successfully conquered human shame, but in doing so he chose to live like a wild, rabid dog in the dirt. The historical champion of modern education and child-rearing abandoned his own flesh and blood to an early grave. As we move closer to the modern era, we encounter Jean-Jacques Rousseau. He was an intellectual giant of the Enlightenment who wrote a revolutionary philosophical treatise called Émile. This book completely changed Western history by teaching parents how to raise, love, and educate children with extreme empathy, infinite patience, and deep psychological nurturing. He was hailed globally as the emotional father of proper child development. But behind his beautiful words lies a harrowing, cold-hearted hypocrisy. Rousseau had 5 biological children with his long-term lover. Instead of raising them according to his own world-changing empathetic principles, Rousseau forced his weeping lover to abandon every single one of their infants, right after birth, at a notorious foundling hospital in Paris. In the 18th century, these underfunded public orphanages were functional death camps. Due to disease and neglect, over 80% of abandoned infants died within their very first year of life. Rousseau knew this horrific reality, yet he did it anyway. The man who wrote the blueprint on how to love and raise children effectively sentenced his own 5 babies to a miserable, anonymous death, simply because he claimed their crying distracted him from his quiet writing time. The final secret is the ultimate, tragic intellectual betrayal in human history. Friedrich Nietzsche was a brilliant, tragic German philosopher who wrote fiercely about the Übermensch, the Superman, and the raw will to power. He urged human beings to break free from the herd mentality, to think for themselves, and to conquer their own limitations. Crucially, Nietzsche openly despised nationalism and absolutely loathed anti-Semitism. He saw hatred as a weakness of the herd. But Nietzsche's mind eventually broke under the weight of his own thoughts, and he spent his final 10 years in a state of silent, catatonic madness. While Nietzsche sat paralyzed, locked inside his broken mind, his sister, Elisabeth Forster Nietzsche, took complete control of his life and his unpublished journals. Elisabeth was a radical, fanatical anti-Semite. She systematically forged, heavily edited, and aggressively rewrote Nietzsche's private notebooks. She deliberately twisted his words, changing his philosophy of individual spiritual freedom into a crude, hateful manifesto of racial supremacy. She packaged this corrupted, fake version of his work and proudly presented it directly to Adolf Hitler. The philosopher who fought his entire life for individual liberation was cruelly twisted in his madness to become the involuntary godfather of the darkest, most murderous regime in human history. The ancient sages and historical thinkers were undeniably giants of the mind, but they walked on heavy feet of clay. Their brilliant philosophies survived through the centuries not because they were perfect, holy human beings, but because they understood the terrifying depth of human darkness from their own first-hand experiences. They knew the abyss because they lived inside it. The storm around you will never stop spinning. Build your citadel, but never blindly worship the flawed men who designed the blueprint. Put down the screen. Sit with the silence. Stay focused. Stay unmoved.